Good afternoon. I'm Domenico Grasso, President of the University of Michigan, and it's my honor. Thank you. I'm sure that's for the University of Michigan. And it's my honor to welcome everyone and help launch this inaugural event of the Samantha Woll Dialogues. I would like to begin by thanking the parents of Samantha, Douglas and Margot Woll, and her sister, Monica Woll Rosen, for the privilege of honoring Samantha's life and impact through this new program. Samantha dedicated herself to building bridges and relationships in our community. She embodied everything we hope for in a graduate of the University of Michigan: leadership, a commitment to fairness, and a desire to make the world a better place. A series of engaging conversations is a meaningful way to continue her legacy. And the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, with its mission of tolerance, empathy, leadership, and courage, is a perfect home for these dialogues. A major university like ours is a crucible of ideas and opinions. We are also a testament to free speech, freedom of expression, mutual respect, and intellectual empathy. There is no better place to exchange and debate ideas, learn from one another, and collaborate on new approaches to society's challenges. This is the essence of critical thinking, the skills that we build in our students. Raoul Wallenberg himself understood this. When he was a student here in the early 1930s, he excelled in his classes. But that wasn't what mattered to him. What was important, he said, was, I really feel that I've learned something. He also loved hitchhiking and did so during his summer breaks here. And I don't recommend hitchhiking today. But he lived in a different time. He had no qualms about hopping into a car with a stranger because it meant engaging with new people. Hitchhiking, he said, gives you training in diplomacy and tact. Diplomacy and tact matter more today than I can express. I've said many times that we can and must be a national model for meaningful, considerate conversations, even on the most uncomfortable topics. This is our moment to show the power of a community that values both free expression and mutual respect. Today's world is fractured and embattled, with people divided over religion, politics, personal identities, immigration, climate change, and so much more. We're forgetting how to talk with each other respectfully and to listen genuinely. I want society to look to Michigan as a beacon of hope, including how to engage in considerate and consequential dialogues with both neighbors and strangers. Today's discussion about whether universities should adopt a definition of anti-Semitism promises to show how we can, in fact, explore similar and divergent viewpoints. Our purpose as a great university is to educate, research, and serve. We will always focus on finding solutions and challenging the status quo with the unwavering objective of improving the world around us. That includes ending anti-Semitism. We are proud of our long-standing efforts to combat anti-Semitism and provide a welcoming campus for Jewish students, faculty, and staff. We have a strong story to tell, and we will always look for ways to strengthen the bonds of community on our campus through conversations like this. Thank you again for being here and supporting authentic dialogues. I mentioned the importance and value of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, and it is my pleasure and honor to introduce its inaugural director, Professor Jeffrey Weidlinger. Jeff and I have had thoughtful conversations in recent months, and I look forward to many more. Please welcome Professor Weidlinger.
Thank you, President Grasso, for being here, for the support you've given to the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, and for your help in fulfilling the Institute's mission. Thank you also to all of you joining us here this afternoon, faculty, fellows, alumni, visitors, and particularly the students, including those of you who are enrolled in the Wallenberg Institute course on religious and ethnic conflict. And thank you to the staff of the Wallenberg Institute, Miriam Mora, Eleanor Camp, and Joe Johnson. Most importantly, I want to thank the family of Samantha Woll, Margot and Doug Woll, and Monica and Ben Rosen, for making this series possible and for trusting the Raoul Wallenberg Institute to honor Sam's memory in this way. Samantha Woll was a proud graduate of the University of Michigan, where she distinguished herself as a passionate community leader from the beginning. She was a committed grassroots organizer, spearheading advocacy programs and events focused on women's rights, fair trade, labor rights, civil rights, refugee rights, the State of Israel, and more. During her time here, Sam served in the Michigan Student Assembly, contributed as a news and editorial staff writer to the Michigan Daily, and represented students as the University of Michigan's delegate to the Ann Arbor City Council. Her greatest impact, however, was felt through her unwavering dedication to building bridges across religious, ethnic, political, and community groups. In October 2023, at the age of 40, Sam was tragically murdered in Detroit. At the time of her passing, she was serving as president of the Isaac Agree Downtown Synagogue, a revitalized Jewish congregation in the heart of Detroit. Sam's influence, however, extended well beyond her own faith. She used her remarkable ability to listen and to unite individuals of diverse backgrounds and beliefs when she founded the Muslim-Jewish Forum of Detroit in 2015. The Samantha Woll Dialogues will carry forward her legacy by championing her values of tolerance, compassion, generosity, and humanity. Part of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute's public programming, these dialogues will address difficult topics suitable to the challenges of our era, with an emphasis on the Wallenberg's mission of studying and combating ethnic and religious hatred, fostering cross-cultural understanding, elevating civic discourse, and developing strategies to fight anti-Semitism, divisiveness, and discrimination. Universities, and particularly public institutions like our own, have unique roles to fulfill, not only in educating and empowering the next generation, but also in serving as a marketplace of ideas where diverse viewpoints and perspectives can be freely expressed, evaluated, and critiqued. In facilitating this type of discussion, we can unite as a community in the pursuit of knowledge and a better world. I'll take this opportunity, therefore, to remind you all that the university's deep commitment to freedom of expression does not extend to the right to substantially disrupt or interfere with the lawful speech of others. You all have index cards, or index cards can be made available during the course of the dialogue, and we'll collect those in about half an hour to guide the last segment of our discussion. I'd now like to introduce our speakers for this evening, our dialogue partners for today. Kenneth Stern is the director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate and an attorney and award-winning author. For 25 years, he was the American Jewish Committee's expert on anti-Semitism. Mr. Stern was the lead drafter of the working definition of anti-Semitism, and he was also an integral part of the defense team in the historic London Holocaust denial case of David Irving versus Deborah Lipstadt. He's argued before the Supreme Court of the United States and testified before both the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. He's been a visiting assistant professor of Jewish Studies and a visiting assistant professor of Human Rights at Bard College, and he's the co-chair of the Higher Education Hate Studies Group for the Eradicate Hate Global Summit. He's the author of several books, including The Conflict Over the Conflict, the Israel-Palestine Campus Debate. Our next speaker is Rabbi Eli Meyerfeld. Rabbi Meyerfeld is the Chief Executive Officer of the Zeckelman Holocaust Center in Farmington Hills. He's a member of the Board of Directors of the Association of Holocaust Organizations, a member of the Board of Council of the Council of the Jewish American Museums, a member of the North American Holocaust Museum Directors Working Group, and a member of the Advisory Council for a new coalition of Black and Jewish unity created to promote solidarity between the Black and Jewish communities in metropolitan Detroit. In recognition of his contributions to Holocaust education, the Detroit News recently honored him as a Michigander of the Year. And I'll add that after being appointed director of the Wallenberg Institute about a year ago, two of the very first people I set out to seek advice from were Ken Stern and Rabbi Meyerfeld. I had a very productive meeting on Zoom with Ken that helped me imagine how this institute was going to develop. And I braved construction on I-696 to go out to the Zeckelman Holocaust Center and had a very productive meeting with Rabbi Meyerfeld as well, who offered his expertise on tolerance education and offered encouragement and support. So I'll now move over there. And actually, as I'm moving over there, I'll ask the first question of our speakers, which I'll ask them both to talk a little bit about the work that they have done on anti-Semitism, about what brought them to this current moment, and about their paths to where we are today. So I'll start with Rabbi Meyerfeld.
Thank you. My mic works? You can test it. Okay, Siri, turn off my phone. No, nobody responded. Okay. Thank you very much for having me. It's interesting because I did not know Sam, but I know everybody who knows Sam. Turns out we had like very high interlapping circles, and so it's really meaningful to be here for the inaugural discussion, and I think that it's a way for continued conversation to be a way for people to see the importance of talking to people you don't agree with, people whose opinions you may not be exposed to, so I'm looking forward to the conversation. I've been the director at the Zeckelman Holocaust Center now for 8 years, and if you had asked me 3 years ago about the work that we do, I would explain to you our mission is to, it's very interesting because President Grasso talked about the mission here at the university, and the words sound very familiar. Engage, educate, and empower. Those are the areas that we work at. And engagement is opportunities like this. Education, obviously, but also to empower people. But if you had asked me 3 years ago, what is it that we're empowering people to do, I would say the things that they take from learning about the Holocaust in whatever way is appropriate for them. And I probably would have told you the following story. We had a group of legislators who came from Lansing to see the museum, and we served them lunch afterwards. And it was a bipartisan group, and during lunch, a number of them started talking about a bill that had stalled in Lansing for foster care. And having learned about the story of the Kindertransports, of children, almost 10,000, who were brought to England, and it saved their lives. At the time, they thought it was just to take them out of harm's way of a war, but it actually ended up, most of their families were murdered. They realized that they ought to be doing more for foster care. And I would have said that was a success because we're empowering people to act. Since October 7th, 2023, a lot of the work that we're doing, we're trying to be more thoughtful about what we want that objective to be. And we actually defined an objective for the center. We said that individuals in society will recognize acts of anti-Semitism, discrimination, and hate-based violence, and will work together and individually to reduce and ultimately prevent such acts. And we realized that we really aren't in the business of fighting anti-Semitism. I say if someone shows up at our museum with a swastika tattooed on their forehead, there's very little we can do for them. But the wide swath of Americans are not anti-Semitic. And how do we give them the information they need in order to be able to feel empowered so that when they hear something that is anti-Semitic or could be understood to be anti-Semitic, they can speak up? So how do you give them that skill? And so really, over the last couple of years, we've thought about the programming that we provide so that students, adults, professionals, as they come into contact with the work that we do, they're seeing it through those eyes. And we train doctors and lawyers and engineers, as well as K-12, really it's grade 7 to 12, age appropriate, but about the Holocaust, but that we want them to understand that there is an empowerment piece to this, to understand how they need to know about what were the ultimate causes so that they can feel that when they see these kinds of things happening in society around them, they feel empowered to act. So that I think is the answer to your question.
Thanks.
First of all, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to meet you and to see all you, especially you students. It's very encouraging because you're the next generation. We're going to be dealing with these, hopefully smarter than our generation. So as Jeffrey said, I worked at the American Jewish Committee for 25 years, and part of the backstory to that is I grew up in New York City. I didn't see much anti-Semitism. I went out to Oregon to law school and to practice law. I started seeing some anti-Semitism both from the right and from the left, and that got me to think about how do we think about these things? What do we do about them? And I got a job at AJC to be their anti-Semitism person, to figure out programming, not just legal things. So I'm working at AJC, and I'm going out to these conferences in the Pacific Northwest that are convened by a guy who was a parish priest in northern Idaho, right near where the Aryan nations were. And he started speaking out about the few Jews and the few blacks in that community that were getting threatened by this, this was the neo-Nazi group that was most significant back at that period of time, the 80s and 90s. And he got his house firebombed with him in it. And he was okay, but he basically got pissed off, to tell you the truth. It was his reaction to it. I don't know, that would be my reaction, that was his reaction. He quit the priesthood, and he formed this group that was bringing together groups that were interfaith, labor, police, racial, others that were coming to talk about how to fight against the neo-Nazis, how to fight against the anti-gay ballot initiatives in the community. And I used to come and do anti-Semitism workshops because people didn't really know much about anti-Semitism, and these were human rights folks, so I did that. One year he asked me to come and do a keynote, and I said, Bill, what do you want me to do? And he said, challenge us to do something we're not already doing. And then I'm racking my head because his was a model I was holding out to others around the country. And then I realized that everybody that was coming to his meetings, including me, was coming as part of my day job. The academics who were coming were there because they were personally interested. And they weren't providing guidance to groups like his and ours and Holocaust centers and others about what works, what doesn't work, why, what are the theories about it, how do you integrate all this? And then I realized from that, wait a minute. To think about anti-Semitism, we also have to think about the fact that it isn't the only type of hatred. That we've always had the ability to define who's us and who's them, and what are the conditions that bring us to see the them as less than human and to feel sort of glorious about beating them up. And so for me, the way I think about anti-Semitism, even though and we'll talk about definitions and so forth, but it has a lot of unique characteristics as other forms of hate do, but you can't see it sitting outside of that capacity to define others that way. And what we learned from the field of hate studies, which Bard has a center, UCLA, other places do, is when you pull together from an interdisciplinary way of looking at hatred, pull together from brain science and social psychology and other fields, you learn some simple lessons. One is that people tend to be attracted to simple answers to complicated problems. They crave certainty, they crave community, and they crave sort of binary thinking. Everything is evil on that side, and everything is fine on my side. And anti-Semitism operates in that specter as well. I could talk more details about it, but that's basically how I think about it.
Great, thanks. So let me stick with you, Ken, and turn to the definitions. Sorry?
We have more volume.
More volume? I don't know how to control that, but okay.
Oh, okay.
So maybe just put your microphones higher.
I can move it up a little higher.
All right, here we go.
Is that better?
Okay, Google, set my phone to silent.
Thank you.
Still not? Okay.
Okay. So the question then is I want to turn to some of the definitions. There's been a lot of talk lately about definitions of anti-Semitism, the problems of defining anti-Semitism. I know the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Education uses the so-called IRA working definition of anti-Semitism that you were involved in the drafting of. And they have advocated its use in colleges and universities. Harvard has declared that they're going to use the IRA definition. Columbia has said that they're going to use the IRA definition. I know there's a lot of people advocating that all universities adopt the IRA definition. So before we actually turn to whether they should or not, I wonder if you can tell us what the IRA definition is and maybe talk about some of the other definitions circulating and what the strengths and weaknesses of them and why it's so difficult to define anti-Semitism.
Well, I will try to do this briefly, but there's, when the Second Intifada started and the collapse of the peace process in 2000, there was an uptick in attacks against Jews in Europe. And there was a group called the European Monitoring Center that put out a report in 2004 describing what was happening on the ground. And they were basically correct in the data they were collecting, but they said, you know, we have a problem. We have all these different European countries, and we're trying to take the temperature of anti-Semitism. And there's no common score sheet for these data collectors to know what to include or to exclude. And they said that they needed to come up with one. And they said they temporarily have this definition of anti-Semitism that looked at stereotypes about Jews. You could argue about whether that makes sense or not, but then they said something that caught my eye. They said, what do we do if a Jew is attacked as a stand-in for an Israeli? And they said, well, you know, we're going to use a temporary definition that looks at these stereotypes. If somebody has these stereotypes about Jews and transfer them to Israelis and then retransfers them back to the Jew in front of them in Paris or London or Bratislava or whatever, that's anti-Semitism and should be counted. But if they're attacked because somebody's upset at an Israeli policy or an Israeli action, that's lamentable but shouldn't be counted. And I'm thinking that's nuts. I grew up in the 50s and 60s. Can you imagine somebody saying if somebody lynched a black person because they had these stereotypes, that's racism, but if they were upset at a Martin Luther King speech, that wouldn't be. So what happened was the head of the EUMC came to the American Jewish Committee annual meeting in May of 2004, and a few weeks before, again, another pipe bomb, this time at a Jewish day school in Montreal in retaliation for an Israeli assassination of a Hamas leader, not anti-Semitism, according to them. So that gave the opportunity, when I pushed her publicly about that, to work with EUMC and people, AJC colleagues, people from the British Jewish community, Australian Jewish community, Michael Berenbaum from the Holocaust Museum, Yehuda Bauer from Yad Vashem, and others, to say, okay, how do we create a tool that will help EUMC to get these data collectors to take the temperature so we can compare across time and borders? And so that's why it was driven with a lot of examples. The examples are the core of it, including things like denying the Holocaust and so forth, but also examples about Israel, because we saw a correlation of things being said about Israel with the level of anti-Semitism. Never said it was causation, never said you say this about Israel, you are an anti-Semite. We saw it as an important marker. Also, the clarity on hate crimes was another thing to do. Flip forward to 2010, and you started seeing, we'll get into this in more detail, some groups saying, wait a minute, professors are teaching, students are saying, people are inviting speakers onto campus that they believe violated the definition, and they started saying this is a problem for Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Flip forward, and obviously I disagreed, it's speech. Flip forward to 2016, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance adopts the text for which I was the lead drafter in 2004 and starts promoting it for use in law and other ways. So that's the IRA definition. You started seeing a reaction to it. There's a definition called the Nexus definition. There's a definition called the Jerusalem Declaration. There's another one, Independent Jewish Voices. You could look at the National Strategy, it has its own sort of definition. And you can argue, and it's great when you teach, about what the differences are, which ones are more susceptible to distortion and abuse about things being said about Israel, which ones are better to understand about hate crimes. But that was the sort of discussion of what's being put together. The commonality that they have, though, to me is the important thing. Because if you want to have a two-item definition of anti-Semitism, they all say this in different words. Anti-Semitism, at its most significant, is a belief that Jews conspire to harm humanity, and that conspiracy gives an explanation for what goes wrong in the world, from Jews killing Jesus to controlling the media to Marjorie Taylor Greene and her Jewish space lasers. That's the importance of it. But as Jeffrey and Eli and I talked about, to get into the weeds of the definition, you can do that, but my view is that none of them belong as a way to police speech, especially on a campus.
Can you all hear okay now?
They don't belong on the campus.
Okay, it shouldn't belong on a campus. None of them.
Maybe I'll ask if you can take the microphone off and talk into it as
We're
well.
going to try and talk louder. You taught classes. We'll project.
Okay.
We'll pretend to talk to each other, and really we're talking to the crowd. There you go.
Okay.
Okay, Ellie, you want to take you want
Okay.
to add anything about the importance of defining anti-Semitism, whether it needs a definition, why?
Okay, so I think this is like, let's lay out a case, okay? We have an expert here who's explaining why these definitions exist. Let's take the next step, which is the topic of the conversation today, which is, ought universities adopt such a definition? And since I have read a lot of what Ken has to say, I've only met him a few minutes ago, I know he's going to ably defend the idea that we shouldn't, so I want to take the other side, and let's see whether we can make this a real discussion. So you have to understand, I think, why this debate matters. And I think that affects us more in the last 700 and some days than it did in times prior. Jewish students are experiencing a disrupted education. They're leaving some campuses because they feel unsafe. Jewish enrollment at the Ivies is down 3 to 5% over the last 2 years. Families are asking their rabbis, the Hillel staff at campuses about safety before they're applying to schools. And some won't consider schools like our own University of Michigan because of safety fears. We have friends who sent 2 children here to the University of Michigan. I would say they bleed blue. They are real University of Michigan family. But their third son is not considering applying here. His older brother had negative experiences here, and he said he's just not going to be applying here. And so I think that what we have to understand is there's not an abstract question. This is about equal educational access. That's what this is really about. And that's new. I would say that we talk about going to school. I went to school in Manhattan, I will admit, 30-some years ago, and it was not the same kind of experience as takes place today. And so I think that we have to understand it in that kind of a way. Everyone understands that racism is entirely unacceptable, but I think a certain amount of anti-Semitism is still tolerated. There's a joke that anti-Semitism is hating Jews a little more than necessary, right? So there's a tolerance for intolerance. And where's that coming from? When you see what's happening, protests are disrupting students' exams, graduation ceremonies, professors validating harmful anti-Israel or anti-Semitic views, leaving Jewish students marginalized in class. That's an experience that's not in the papers, but we've just talked to someone at Oakland University who's having that experience. These are real challenges. And with, again, students transferring, refusing to enroll due to these kind of unsafe climates. My alma mater, Cooper Union, in Manhattan had an experience where students ended up, the campus security barricaded them inside a library. They were visibly Jewish. They had just been in a Jewish program. And protesters came and were banging on the doors. They ended up smuggling them out of the building after being held there for a couple of hours. There's a civil rights case and other civil cases that are currently ongoing that the judges in the last couple of months said need to go forward because of the behavior of the university. Having a definition fills the gap. It names anti-Semitism clearly, so that it can be treated with seriousness like other forms of bias. And it's important to note that we're not talking about a ban on hate speech. Back in 1989, the federal courts threw out a hate speech code here at the University of Michigan. The case was called Doe versus Michigan. Dr. Stern, you said
Those
that...
are my parents and my son.
I'm sorry,
I
Mr.
skipped a
Stern.
generation.
Okay. You wrote that that code was amongst the most ugly and egregious efforts to limit free speech, and they were found to be unconstitutional. So these really aren't discussions anymore about hate speech. That's not why we're here. We're here because defining anti-Semitism, as a lot of the examples you showed, aren't self-evident. Unlike racism or sexism, people still debate what anti-Semitism is, and without a definition, enforcement is therefore going to be arbitrary. Universities have definitions for harassment, for plagiarism, for bias standards. Hatred of Jews shouldn't be the exception. And when you talk about unsafe, we're not just talking about physical security, you're talking about disrupted exams, silenced voices, and ultimately loss of opportunity for Jewish students. The Atlantic Monthly just did a story. They talked about Jewish families that are redirecting their children away from schools they perceive as unsafe. A lot of schools in the South that the article talks about that have found ways to make students feel much more welcome and comforting, and they're bringing in a lot of new Southern schools, bringing in a lot more Jewish kids. I think another problem is that a good faith debate can't always be assumed. Sometimes students aren't coming open-minded, and professors sometimes are validating harmful speech. Ken wrote in a recent article for the Knight First Amendment Institute. If you Google K-N-I-G-H-T, Knight, Kenneth Stern, you'll find the article. It's called A Bad Deal. By adopting an IRA definition of anti-Semitism, universities are sacrificing academic freedom. And in it, he wrote, if faculties are mistreating, harassing, or discriminating against students, that's one thing, and campuses already have many mechanisms for addressing those concerns. The problem is they don't. That's exactly the issue. There is a definition of harassment. I brought the Student Code of Conduct with me. Section V says that all these forms of harassment can be against people in terms of bias, but there's not a definition to explain what would be considered anti-Semitic in those circumstances. So yes, we have rules for harassment, but we don't have a way to apply it to the case of anti-Semitism. And this way, with the definition, you set a useful boundary. Criticism of Israel is fine. We're talking, let's say, about the IRA definition, and it's clear about that. Criticism of Israel is okay, but denying Jewish people's right to self-determination or using classic anti-Semitic tropes, they wouldn't be. Another challenge is that faculty administration can't always be trusted to moderate alone. Some teachers shut down hate speech, but others enable it. And of course, some abuse happens outside the classroom. A definition would ensure consistent standards. And again, a definition does not ban speech. It discriminates, it distinguishes criticism from harassment. Just like Title IX does for sexual harassment, Title IX and the related code of conduct here at U of M would be a great instructive purpose. It did chill some interactions, certainly for the better, but I don't think anybody argues that it curtailed sex among students. The right of students to behave as they wish stays, but there's a definition that says what's okay and what's not. Defining boundaries for hate speech shouldn't curtail honest, difficult conversations on campus, which I know you're very much in the forefront of trying to encourage. Another thing which comes up in terms of the Title VI definitions, harassment, is that Judaism isn't just a religion. So for example, I don't know how many of you are familiar, but the Pew Foundation did actually two studies, one in 2013 and one in 2020, where they were identifying people who said they were Jewish. 20% of the people who responded said they have no religion, yet they described themselves as Jewish. And 83% of that 20% said they were proudly Jewish. So clearly being Jewish is not just a religion. That wouldn't work for Catholicism or Greek Orthodox. You can't say, I have no religion, but I'm Greek Orthodox. And yet it is the case that 1 out of 5 Jews says that about themselves. So anti-Semitism targets Jews as a people, not just a faith. And IRA reflects that. Federal guidance calls it shared ancestry, and I guess that's a close approximation.
Just to interject, if I may, on the Title VI, because people may not know what
yeah,
Title VI
okay,
is.
go ahead.
Just the Title VI is Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, and nationality. And in the last 20 years or so, the United States government has repeatedly emphasized that that also includes shared ancestry and ethnicity, which is a category designed to deliberately include and make it clear that groups like Jews, Muslims, Sikhs are also included
Protected.
in that, are also protected classes.
So since 2019, the Department of Education is using a particular definition, the IRA definition, and just from like an instrumentalist argument, universities are at risk if they're not using that to measure what's going on campus. So like sexual harassment definitions, IRA provides a clarity and enforceability. And the truth is the university has other standards that they use that are beyond legal requirements for vendors, investors, research partners. IRA would fit into that same model. And so if you have a case with vendors where we have requirements for environmental impact, for fair wage, which are part of the university's choices about who it chooses to do business with. You could do the same thing. It's not just about interactions on campus. It's about how the university chooses its partners. Ken wrote, we'll save that for another time. I'm going to close. I know we're going to come up. We're going to come up to it. So, okay. I think universities have an opportunity to hold themselves out as an example of higher standards in many domains, like I was talking about: labor, environment, human rights. And a definition for anti-Semitism provides that same kind of a tool: clarity, consistency, and equal treatment. Without a definition, Jewish students lack equal opportunity to learn. With a definition, universities have a framework to protect them and to preserve open debate.
Thanks. Ken, do you agree?
Maybe not. So just one thing for clarity, the executive order in 2019 directed federal agencies to use the definition. It did not impose it on universities. Now, I know that general counsels and so forth are aware of this, but their job is also at a university to protect free speech and academic freedom as well. It's not to just cut and paste what the federal government does. I think part of what's being lost in the discussion about the definition is that there have been cases that, exactly as you say, Cooper Union, others where Jewish students have been threatened, bullied. There have also been cases where Muslim students have been threatened and bullied and doxxed. That's part of the environment, and the question is, what do you do about it? And what you should do is focus on making clear that bullying isn't okay, discrimination isn't okay, true threats aren't okay, harassment isn't okay, intimidation isn't okay. But we're a university. We're going to expect to hear things that disturb us, including anti-Zionism and other types of things. And then the university has an obligation to teach about that, not to try to censor things. I don't see the parallel to questions about racism. There's no other definition of anti-Semitism or definition of hatred that's used in Title VI. But could you imagine a parallel one? Could you imagine one with political examples about racism? One could make an argument if they set up a definition of racism that was created in the same way the text that became the IRA definition did, to sort of take a temperature, to say, okay, opposition to affirmative action is a data point you want to take in. Opposition to Black Lives Matter, opposition to removal of Confederate statues. You can make an argument for a data collection thing. That would make sense. You want to enshrine in government that those are indicia of racism and to try to punish that type of speech on a campus. We had just recently, Columbia adopted it, and you had a Jewish scholar who's a scholar of genocide, whose family were Holocaust survivors, who said, I don't think I can teach about genocide anymore. I don't know if I could sign Hannah Arendt. That's the chilling effect. If you look at where the definition has been applied, look at Florida. It's going back to 2019 and then more recently too, where it was adopted. And what happened on a campus? You had an edict that there should be word searches on classes for Israel, Palestine, other things as well, to look at what a professor is teaching. Look at what happened recently, and after Harvard adopted it, and then there was that was back in December. That same couple of weeks, there was a resolution of a Title VI case for George Washington University. And it's very instructive to think about those two cases together. Because Harvard accepted that they're going to use the definition. They said we're only going to use it for disciplinary purposes. You immediately had Larry Summers talking about an academic program, complaining that it violated the definition. You had in GW a case where there was an allegation out of the same class of anti-Palestinian and anti-Semitic problems under Title VI. And the Office of Civil Rights resolved it. There were outside groups, Jewish groups, saying, yes, adopt the definition, apply it. Office of Civil Rights didn't. But think about that for a second. If the resolution had required it, flip the Harvard situation with that. Imagine applying the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, and there is a definition of anti-Palestinian animus. I guarantee you those two things clash. How would you deal with River to the Sea? You can't violate one and sustain the other at the same time. And that's the problem here. You're looking at speech as the solution to the problem as opposed to how we should be teaching about it. You're absolutely right, Eli. One of the things I love is there's a program called Sway, which is an AI-guided one that helps students on opposing views of issues like abortion or this engage in positive conversations. That to me is the way to go. When you look at targeting speech, it promotes authoritarianism. It promotes people that are outside, they're going to be hunting speech. It violates, in my view, the civil rights. And there's a case called SJP versus Abbott, came out of Texas, put into the college code. The judge said it's viewpoint discrimination. There's another case out of Haverford, which was very important too, and I think it's one of the things that I think is important for the Jewish community to address. There's a debate in the Jewish community about whether a particular view of Israel and Zionism is required to be inside the tent. And there are young Jews for whom anti-Zionism is part of their faith. They can't believe in the state of Israel, justifying it with how Judaism teaches them to treat the stranger or how to repair the world. I disagree with them, but I'm not going to call those folks anti-Semites, and that's a religious question. It's an internal Jewish question that we have to engage. I don't want the state to do that, but giving you, and this I'll end on, a final example of where that has been decided. Germany adopted the definition and applied it. There were Jewish protesters about the war in Gaza that were labeled anti-Semitic under this definition, and somebody wrote, I thought very tellingly, Germany is yet again deciding what it means to be Jewish, what's the correct Jewish value. I don't want the German government doing it. I don't want the United States government. I don't want the administration and the university to do it. I want to encourage discussion of why people have such different views, not shut it down with blunt tools.
I want to return in a minute to the OCR definition and what the problems maybe are with the way discrimination is being handled on campuses right now, and why we need a definition of anti-Semitism when we have prohibitions on the creation of a hostile environment and discrimination and processes for dealing with that already. I'll ask you that, but I also want to see about questions. Are we collecting the cue cards? So we'll begin collecting cue cards if people want to write down questions and pass them up, and in a few minutes we'll go to some audience questions.
Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the things that really worries me at the moment, right? So the Title VI was a great tool. I actually was a complainant for a group of Jewish high school students where there was a Kick a Jew Day and the administration did nothing. And what do? We worked with the Department of Education. They came into the school district. They said, you got to do better. Let's investigate it together. Let's come up with the solution together. Let's work. And they came up with something that was actually going to work because they were educators. Now what do we have? We have the Department of Education being totally gutted. We have the government deciding, somebody said something and we're going to decide to claw back all your money. bully and threaten universities. So we don't have the process anymore. And that on top of the fact that there was a backlog of anti-Semitism cases before we decided we're getting rid of the Department of Education.
Michigan is one of 60 schools, I believe, under investigation from the Office of Civil Rights, which
Congratulations.
You're in good company. I think that you'll all enjoy the idea that I think Ken and I agree. Because I think the difference is a lot of what you've described are intended to chill speech on campus. And I think that a definition is necessary for purposes of how the university handles code of conduct, handling questions of harassment, again, vendors, the kinds of civil rights issues that universities have to deal with. In terms of classroom time, I think more viewpoint diversity will be great for universities. There was a study that was done just a few months ago, I saw it in pre-publication, the New York Times had a link to it, that in classrooms where Edward Said's Orientalism is assigned, in less than 5% of the cases is Samuel Huntington or other works that are critical of Orientalism assigned as well. So students should be seeing these kinds of other opinions in the same classrooms, and that's not happening enough. In many cases, you can guess which of the two sides of an argument tends to get presented in class. There was an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal called "My Students Aren't Snowflakes." Also, you should Google it. But it talks about someone who started a class called "You Can't Say That in Class, or Can You?" and encouraged students to discuss things like abortion, transgender rights, guns, religion, and taught students how to have those conversations in class. None of this discussion should really be, there has been weaponization of a definition of anti-Semitism. But so much of what I think needs to happen now is for teachers and universities to have a definition that allows them to know what's the things that they have to be watching out for, and what are the things where they need to encourage more discussion. And I think that would be healthy for the universities to have such a definition.
If I could respond, I think it would actually galvanize people to protect free speech and not want to teach. I've seen professors who are talking about, wait a minute, there are outside groups hunting speech, which I've documented since 2010. If you want to engage these issues and you're a Jewish studies professor, why are you going to risk it when you could talk about the shtetl? So it's going to decrease the teaching about this. And I agree with you that there's an imbalance in some places where what's being taught. And what I've said to university leadership going back to the time when I started working on these issues, like in 1990, is if there is an imbalance, the thing isn't necessarily and certainly not to tell a professor what to do, is to find other ways to make that available for the students. Bring in visiting scholars, bring in other ways to engage the issues. But once you start telling a professor what they can teach in a class, it's not that different from McCarthyism, right? So again, that's a problem. The definition, think about it this way. Let's go back to the definition of anti-Palestinian animus, okay? Imagine if you're a professor that has a sort of right-wing view on Israel and you refer in your class to Judea and Samaria. Or you say you think Palestinians or Arabs are sort of people. And you give a student a bad grade. Is that going to be
Not harassment.
Well, but the point is, the question is not to look at the ideas, but look at to the teaching. When I teach about anti-Semitism, and I know we're getting into Israel and Zionism and so forth towards the end of the class, what I tell students is, you can Google what I've written. You sort of know what I think. The one way to get a bad grade in my class is to parrot back to me what you think I think. I want to hear what you think, and you're going to do better if you disagree with me. You have to support it with evidence, but I want to encourage us. So it's about how you teach. It's not about what comes out of a professor's mouth in terms of one idea or not, and putting it on the filter of a definition.
Let me turn to some of the critiques of adopting definitions of anti-Semitism. I'm going to actually start with an unlikely source and read a quote from Jonathan Greenblatt, the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League. who recently said, and this is a quote, "Resolving the very real crisis of anti-Semitism should not jeopardize the entire enterprise of our system of higher education. We should be able to hold institutions accountable for protecting Jewish students, faculty, and staff, while maintaining a commitment to academic freedom and independent inquiry." And maybe I'll also just read another quote from Judge Allison Burroughs of the U.S. District Court in Boston just a few days ago in the decision against the federal government's case against Harvard, saying that the Trump administration has, quote, "used anti-Semitism as a smokescreen for a targeted, ideologically motivated assault on this country's premier universities." And maybe I'll ask both of you to respond to those allegations, those critiques. Elliot.
Again, I think what Jonathan is getting at is that there is a real issue today of safety on campus, and that having universities have some definition of anti-Semitism that helps them suss out when students are being harassed is a tool that's necessary at the same time as you want universities to be a place of open inquiry. Though I think that's the point. We want students to be able to feel welcome here. We're here, so let's say here, but at all the universities around the country. They should be welcome, and they shouldn't feel that they need to self-censor in order to be able to participate in campus life. That's really, I mean, when you talk about the ability to share ideas in a classroom, the first step is to get them here. And right now, we're providing an environment where students don't feel welcome.
Yeah, and Greenblatt is supporting the idea of adopting the definition as law and so forth. But the reality is that we want, it's like you said, students to engage these different points. If you have, imagine again a definition of anti-LGBTQ things, people are going to be hunting for a speech to go and punish, as opposed to thinking about how do we actually educate it. So I can't see an environment in which this becomes anything other than draconian for faculty, for students, and for others. And I think that the judge's opinion is absolutely right. There's, I mean, we can talk about politics, but the basic idea here is that, is this really about anti-Semitism? I don't think so. If you look at J.D. Vance, when he was a senator, he talked about emulating what Viktor Orban was doing in Hungary, right? Just go after these, sort of liberal institutions. And I work at Bard College. We have a school, Central European University, bringing liberal arts to master's programs and so forth. It was kicked out of Budapest. It's reconstituted in Vienna, of all places. Of course, you couldn't engage in ideas there. I don't know that we want to go down that same road. As that, and it's part of the anti-DEI. I have problems with some DEI too, but this is going after speech, which is why you have Bret Stephens against using this definition, while you have Batya Sanger, against it, while you had Tablet Magazine going against it, while you had Christopher Rufo, who's one of the architects of the attack on the academy. Even he's saying this is a bad idea because he sees it as the same as going after DEI, in the same way, looking at ideas. And to give you one of my favorite examples of why this is a problem, there was as you said, I testified a couple of times in front of the Senate. There was a markup of a bill to use it. It got, there was an amendment that Bernie Sanders put forward that I think killed it for this session because it was supported by Rand Paul, who's a Republican conservative libertarian. Rand Paul talked about Joan Rivers among 400 other Jewish comedians. He said they would have a problem with what they said. And he gave this example. I'm going to butcher it compared to how he did it. But he had Joan Rivers saying, God didn't want Jews to exercise. If God wanted Jews to exercise, he would have put diamonds on the floor so they could bend over and find them. Funny, not funny, but when you start hunting speech, that would probably violate the definition about mendacious things about Jews. I don't want to go down that way. I want to use differences of opinion to engage. And the conference that Jeffrey and I were at in January, I got asked a question by a British fellow who's a friend, who said, what would you do if somebody said to you, you're encouraging or condoning or committing genocide. I can understand why that's disturbing to a student. I said, I'm glad that they asked. It's on their mind. Let's engage it. It's speech. Let's teach. I have a colleague at Bard when, after October 7th, she heard students talking about settler colonialism and anti-Semitism and Zionism and genocide and so forth. She said, we're a college. Why don't we have a class about what these words mean and why people hear them differently? To me, that's a lot more of a creative approach and an effective approach for a university than posting on the walls, these are things that are going to get you in trouble for thinking and saying.
And by the way, we do offer courses on anti-Semitism that I hope students will take. We also will be offering, or I'll be offering anyway, in the winter a course on Zionism, also to try to define those terms and see what they actually mean from a variety of perspectives. There's a lot of really good questions from the audience, so I want to pose some of those. And I'll start with this one, which is, how can I responsibly raise my voice about injustice in Israel without being accused of or perpetrating anti-Semitism?
Raise your voice. I think that there are some people that are going to hunt speech, but I think, life is too short. You see things that disturb you, you talk about it. The question, there are a lot of Jews who are disturbed by what's going on post-October 7th. I mean, obviously, we're all very concerned about what happened on October 7th. There were still hostages. It was traumatic for Jewish communities. It brings up memories to people, their family stories of the Holocaust. From my family, I know about a great-grandfather in a pogrom. But from the pro-Palestinian side, too, it was traumatic and continues to be. The Nakba, the displacement, can you imagine being told, today you're going to be out of Gaza, how many, so to raise those issues, is fine. I have a piece, I'll give you my email. It's kstern@bard.edu. I can email you a piece about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and what it basically boils down to is there's some of it that's clearly anti-Semitic when you cut and paste, Jews control the world to Israel controls the world, or those classic stereotypes about, Jewish conspiracy, that's anti-Semitism. When you talk about Palestinians, you say, wait a minute, my objection isn't to Jews, it's about what this means to me and my ability to control my life. That's not anti-Semitism. It's not anti-Semitism when young Jews, if not now, or Jewish Voice for Peace, start talking about what their Jewish values mean and lead them to a position on the politics of Israel. And there's a whole bunch of stuff in the gray area, and that's okay, because we live life in the gray area. You don't have to label everything.
But of course, it's hard for students to be in that gray area because they're seeing the consequences of criticizing, of what they see as criticizing Israel. And what I like about that question is it doesn't just say being accused, but also of perpetrating. So it's a student who's actually really concerned about wanting to be good, wanting to be a good citizen, wanting to be constructive in the world, and worried about how it's going to be perceived. So I think it's an interesting question.
I think one area that would take someone out of the gray, and not everybody necessarily believes it. Ken's just describing there are Jews who don't believe it, but if you believe that Jews have the right to self-determination, that they have a right to self-organize into their own country, like every other peoples have around the world, then your criticisms of Israel aren't anti-Semitic. Where it starts to get gray is when someone says, Jews uniquely, of all countries, doesn't deserve to exist as a Jewish country, even though almost every other country has an ethnographic piece to it. The United States being here, we sort of see it as we're the unique ones. We're the country that's for all comers. So that takes somebody out of the gray area. Some people are in the gray area, as you were discussing, and then the question is how do they do that without falling afoul? But for those who are able to say, I understand why Jews want to have a country where they are in the majority, where they're coming up with their own laws, that's a way of staying out of the gray.
Yeah, if I could just add a little bit of complexity to it. So when I wrote my book in 2020, which was 3 years before, October 7th.
A generation ago.
Yeah, absolutely. But the lessons still hold true, and I decided I needed a basic, sort of 101 description in a chapter of what's the Jewish narrative, the connection from the Bible, the land, where synagogues face Israel, the liturgy, and all that. And I needed one for the Palestinian narrative too. And I did that about, they were there, and then Jews have always been there, but they've been emigrating more since the 1880s, and this is the impact it's had on our lives. And I sent a draft of the book to a colleague who asked me a question. She said, it's really important which one you put first. And I thought about that, and I ended up putting the Jewish one first because that's the one I'm more familiar with, but I had a long footnote at the end recounting that comment. And I said, how would you have felt if you're a supporter of Israel, if you're Jewish? And I had decided to put the Palestinian narrative first, and then brought in Jews as secondary characters, mostly to thwart what you wanted to do. How would that have made you feel? That's how some of the pro-Palestinian folks feel. So the reality is, at the end of the day, we're all human beings. We tend to go into our tribal tents, and one of the things that I think is most important is to try to have especially on a college, the intellectual curiosity and the emotional empathy to understand, if you were in a different circumstance, how you might view things differently. And what I say, a lot of times on a campus is that to students is that I bet none of you are going to solve Israel-Palestine. You do have an ability to how you control, your relationships with each other, and that aren't you curious if there's somebody who has a strong difference of opinion from you on this issue, why they have an opinion? Why this otherwise friendly student in this class or that class has views that you think are deplorable, if not evil? And shouldn't you want to engage with that student to really find out why and how they think? I tell them I used to be a criminal defense lawyer. I would have been committing malpractice if I didn't think of the case about how I would have approached it if I were the prosecutor. Even if you're a passionate advocate on one side or another, doesn't it behoove you to understand the other side's argument better? That's what colleges should be doing, engaging why people think of these things. And again, why we get into these buckets that become self-sustaining and isolating, as opposed to educating and getting people to be critical thinkers about these issues.
Okay, I want to get into some of the other questions. Sure. There's another bunch of questions that are dealing with similar issues, which is about why the special attention to the case of anti-Semitism. Shouldn't we be looking at definitions of other types of hatred, other types of bigotry, particularly anti-Islam sentiment is a big one. One question, if I say Iran is a Nazi state, is that an anti-Islam statement? So maybe if I can address that to both of you, why the special attention on this case?
Violence against Jews, as Jews, is overwhelmingly I forget the percentage, but it's like a ridiculous percentage of cases of acts of violence against people because of their national origin. And so there needs to be special attention to it, particularly, again, for the topic that's at hand, because the definition is relatively difficult to pin down. And so the harassment often leads to violence in the last couple of years. Outside of the United States, it's been awful. And I think that the circumstances on universities, again, is an opportunity for leadership, for showing how people can live together. A number of the conversations we've had over the last little bit, we're talking about DEI and some of the challenges. The universities have gone through the last 10 years, let's say, of trying to understand what its role is in society, what its responsibilities are. The challenge of anti-Semitism and the amount of violence that's been directed towards Jews really is not proportional to the number of Jews either on campus or in the United States or in the world. And so therefore, this is an unusual case.
Right. Jews are 2% of the population of the United States and 0.2% of the global population. Yet, I think you're correct that there may be a lot of emphasis on anti-Semitism, but there is also a lot of emphasis on blaming that
I mean,
2%,
outright
0.2%.
anti-Semitism, without worrying about a particular definition one way or another. You know, having a, what was it, kick the Jew day?
Yeah.
Right? Those aren't like edge cases, right? There is a lot of acts of violence that are being committed against Jews in the United States, very far disproportionate to their population.
Right, and the challenge with the definition is, again, you don't use that for Trump whining and dining, a Holocaust denier. You only use it about speech about Israel, of which is mostly political. That's the Pandora's box is what I'm worried about. There's an anti-Islam definition. There's a definition of anti-Palestinian. There's one on Hindu phobia. Are we going to have our universities now have a definition of every type of bigotry and what could be said and not said? I think that would be a deplorable thing, and I think it would be impossible to teach under that circumstance. What's a really instructive exercise, and I encourage you to do it if you have the patience, is read some of the task forces on anti-Semitism and on Islamophobia, anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian animus, and read them in tandem. They are like mirror images of each other. And anti-Semitism is getting much more attention. I'm not sad about anti-Semitism getting attention, although I am sad about people politicizing it. But you're looking at what's happening to Muslim students. I've talked to Palestinian professors who, have students coming in their office crying about what's happening in Gaza with people that they know, and they have no training on how to deal with that. There's students that have been doxxed and so forth. So you read the reports in tandem, and what you find is each side believes that the administration favors the other side, and each can make a point to support it. The pro-Israel students say, how come the pro-Palestinian folks get away with encampments and things? We don't do that. We don't violate the rules. How come they get away with it? And the pro-Palestinian folks say, wait a minute. How come the university is cracking down on its rules now? They didn't do it with Occupy Wall Street. They didn't do it with apartheid South Africa. Why the double standard about this issue? So all this is happening at the same time, which is why I'm glad I'm not a general counsel. But if you look at the one thing, again, to look at Harvard, not to do a comparison, but to point out the statistics of what was more troubling to me about one of the survey questions. The two task forces had a survey of students done together. 26% of the Jewish students feared for their physical safety. It was 56% of the Muslim students.
Let me turn to another question. There's a bunch of questions, actually, that deal with similar types of issues, which is backlash. Are these policies creating more anti-Semitism by giving the impression that Jews are a special case? Are Trump's measures to combat anti-Semitism just creating more, is the phrasing of one of these questions. There's a few others that look at, that ask similar variations.
And you want to start?
Yeah, I understand the argument that some have made that, wait a minute, why are Jews getting special rules when we're going after DEI and other things, and there may be some backlash. I get it, and I don't think that that's wrong, but I'm more worried about the general politics at the moment and going after using anti-Semitism as a wedge issue to try to destroy democracy in many ways. I think free speech is an important cornerstone of the ability to fight hatred, anti-Semitism included, and if we lose that fight, it's going to be much harder to identify and combat anti-Semitism. One of my favorite quotes actually came from, how many people here know the name Michael Brooks? Okay, a lot of people from the University of Michigan, right? Michael said years ago, and I won't repeat all his quips because they're not appropriate for this audience, but this one is. He said, when you make it about Jews, you lose. And what he meant by that was not focus or think about anti-Semitism. He said, when you focus on what a campus should be, Jews will be protected. If the campus is working the way it's supposed to be, Jews will be okay. When you make special rules for Jews, that's a problem. I think the same could be said for any group. The campus should work in a way that nobody should be harassed, nobody should be intimidated. everybody should be disturbed by ideas, including Jewish students on all sides of the debate.
I think that really leads into the question. If we want people to feel safe on campus, and students understand what the limits are for what's considered challenging conversations and what's actual harassment, you do need a way for them to have those definitions to give them those barriers.
No, because it's speech, right? So harassment is I get in your face and I harass you. There are legal, technical definitions of harassment.
But if the things I say to you are, you're short, right? So we know that height is one of the protected classes in civil rights. If I say you're redheaded, I don't like your beard, those, perhaps you're Sikh, then I could say that the beard is but we need definitions, and that's why the civil rights has all of these categories in it.
It doesn't, this is from the right in some ways, but the left is also decided about microaggressions and other things, about certain things that you can't hear. And that tells you certain things that you shouldn't think. It tells you a value of groupthink. And in college, you want to become critical thinkers and think for yourselves. So I don't think any, type of...
It shouldn't be just the Jews, though, who have to have that.
No,
it shouldn't be that the only microaggression that's acceptable on campus is anti-Jewish.
No, I agree. Listen, I don't think any type of harassment, intimidation, stuff. Microaggressions, I think, are microaggressions. I think you deal with that with more speech. And if you again, harass somebody, you vilify them, you get in their face. Some of the incidents we've seen, right, on post-October 7th, clearly harassing. But when you start talking about, somebody's expressing something, that's problematic. If read the SJP versus Abbott case, it talked about using this definition to guide the University of Texas system. And the judge said, wait a minute, there's an example there of comparing Israel to Nazi Germany. What would would it violate a disciplinary code for a student to sit calmly in a class, hands folded, and make a comparison? Under the disciplinary code, that would be a problem. If you look at the legislation that was passed, it talked about from the river to the sea as an anti-Semitic speech. That it talks in the preamble to the legislation that should be targeted. I don't want to start going down that road. I want to say, if you say river to the sea, we can discuss what that means. If I come up to you with a baseball bat in my hand and said I'm going to beat you up because you're defending something with river to the sea, that's a problem.
Of course, Title VI has a standard of severe and pervasive.
And objectively offensive.
Right.
Right.
Which doesn't involve a baseball bat, by the way. Those cases are much easier.
Yeah, but let's look at the river from the sea. That's a good example of this, right? Because that could come. Imagine which example, right? So you had Elise Stefanik going after the college president, saying, "River to the sea is not calling for genocide against Jews. Doesn't that violate the policy of the university?" Well, first of all, it's bait and switch, because the river to the sea, I find it offensive. 66% of Jewish students find it eliminationist. 14% of Muslim students believe it that way. And 2 points. One is that you should be able to say, and First Amendment law protects your ability to say horrible things, including exterminationist things. David Duke was running for a statewide office in Louisiana when I chaired the anti-Semitism desk. I wrote a backgrounder on him. When he was a student at LSU, he got on the radio and said all blacks should be sent to Africa, all Jews should be exterminated, and the next year he walked around with a Nazi uniform. He was not disciplined. He would have loved to have been disciplined because that would have made it a First Amendment fight. He was, vilified for that. And then, again, to get back to the river to the sea, look at it this way. If I were a Palestinian, I'd say, what's all this about what an 18-year-old is talking about river to the sea and may not know which river and which sea? You know, looking at the history of the Likud party, that had a platform in 1977 that talked about Jewish sovereignty from the river to the sea. And if you look at the current state of affairs, who has sovereignty over the river to the sea? So why are we nitpicking about what expressions mean and trying to put it into law and policy as opposed to look at how people look at things differently and why?
We only have a few minutes left, so let me get in one final question, which is, the question is, if there is no definition of anti-Semitism, how do you recommend targeted students handle anti-Semitic rhetoric? And I'll just kind of rephrase that a little bit more generally, that I think we all recognize that a lot of Jewish students on campus are feeling targeted and are feeling unsafe and shunned. And regardless of whether a definition of anti-Semitism is adopted or the university decides to use one, there are other mechanisms that they can use to file complaints to the Title VI system, here through ECRT. There's other methods that they can use, but how should they respond? What should Jewish students who are feeling harassed and targeted do in response?
Again, I think that there's a difference between people who want to have a conversation and what actually is harassment. Students feeling unsafe because someone's getting in their face and the things that they're saying are hateful, right? So there's also a difference between David Duke walking around and saying those things and then walking over to Jews and saying you belong in an oven, right? Those are different kinds of statements. So the student who's saying, how do I deal with anti-Semitic statements that are being made? Are they being made to you directly? Or are they being made, in chants, right? How are you being made to feel uncomfortable? If it's harassment against you as an individual, again, without a definition, it's going to be difficult for you to file a Title VI complaint, but that's what you're going to be doing. And schools, as you were describing, have a requirement to keep kids safe. They have to make sure these kinds of circumstances aren't pervasive, that they're not part of the problem. And they really are. There are universities where objectively the schools were not doing enough to make sure that kids were being kept safe from harassment. Kids did not feel safe in those environments. So if someone's, on the other hand, having a conversation and said, I don't think there should be any Holocaust studies at the University of Michigan, because I think that's giving too much right. So then you can have a conversation with them. What makes you think that that's okay, not okay? There's a Jewish studies program here, or it's about Israel and Palestine. Or it could be on any topic. I think Jews have too much power. I think that they control the banks. Any of those topics, there could be an opportunity for discussion. Or they could say, those are the same tropes that were used by the Nazis. You know where they got them from? Do you know where you're getting them from? Can we take a look at what history has to teach us about these things? And you can respond to them. So I think that there is opportunity when it's a one-on-one and it's not someone trying to make you feel unsafe.
Yeah, and I think that there are Jewish students in many universities that are stressed under this circumstance, and I think it's also the anti-Zionist Jewish students who are being called capos and traitors that are also stressed, as are Muslim students and as are other students. I think on an individual level, go to professors, go to colleagues, go to your Hillel, go to other places to get support. But I think ultimately the responsibility is the universities. And when I wrote another book on anti-Semitism back in 2006, and I remember distinctly doing a program on how to think about anti-Semitism, and didn't say use the definition even though it had come out by then, at the Hillel at Columbia. And what was happening is that students were hearing things. They were hearing things about Israel and Jews and couldn't quite figure out how do I engage and how do I think about this. So the director there of the Hillel brought me and a guy named Eric Ward, who's a good buddy, who's written about anti-Semitism.
Sat in this chair just a couple months ago, right?
Yeah, I know Eric since he was at the University of Oregon. I've known him 30 years. Brilliant guy. And we did a training, and it was like 7 o'clock at night. 11 o'clock, I'm still sitting at a table upstairs with 3 or 4 students. And one of them says, who's now a very well-known journalist, this is the first time I felt comfortable saying what I really think about Israel. And I asked her, I said, well, is it just about here as it's going on? No, my friends feel the same way in other places. And is it just about Israel? No. It's about other things too, and I understand it. You're 18, you're 22, you're worried about saying something that somebody's going to label you a different way. You're worried about grades, you're worried about friends, you're worried about relationships. I get it. I remember being that age, right? So the responsibility for universities is not to ignore that. It's to find ways to bridge those gaps. That's why I'm very excited about this AI program I mentioned that college is using for its first-year orientation that engages students into looking at different points of view. And once you sort of tap that capacity to say, that's what we're here for, I think that will lower the temperature. Are there still going to be cases where people are acting really badly? Yeah, you don't need a definition to deal with that. You need a policy about actual harassment. Focus on the actions, not the words, but then also build the structure where people can teach about this more. And that's one of the things I love about what I'm doing at Bard is that having a center to look at the issue of hatred, why we get into these us and them buckets, how do we navigate that? Once you have the intellectual capacity to understand what happens to us as human beings, what the brain science is, what the social psychology is, what the economic implications are, what the other ways that we can think about this. Once you understand what happens to us as human beings when our identity is getting threatened on an issue like this, if we have the intellectual capacity to understand what's happening to us, we're much better able to engage it productively.
Before I thank you both, let me just make a couple of announcements. The first is our next event is going to be on September 30th on the topic of what is tolerance, and that will feature our own Andy Murphy and Carla Goldman and Amir Hussein on a discussion, again, what is tolerance. And the other announcement, the students who are in the ethnic and religious tolerance class that's meeting now, you'll meet in our regular classroom at 5:45, so say in 15 minutes. And on that note, please join me in thanking our two panelists. Thank you. And thank you all for coming.